Hello folks. Did you miss California? Well, surprise! For one more destination, we are back in the Golden State. There's one more region of the state that I feel is most important to cover here on the Coverage Project, since we do have access on our way up north. Take a look at these though. These are huge, not your ordinary trees. And that is the whole theme of this last location. More on these trees, of course, as we progress today. As we've already discovered, California is full of so many different landscapes, climates, and biomes. Each region has its own little feature of geography, it seems. From Southern California with the dry deserts, to the more Mediterranean hills and climates, to Northern California where it gets a lot more rainy, a little bit more temperate, colder. And here we are at the northernmost point of the state. After this, well, it's another state, but at the very tippy top of California is the North Coast. Pretty aptly named, right? It's the most northern part of the coast of California, and this North Coast is most distinctly known, notorious for the redwood trees that surround this entire area, full of might and size. These are the dominant force that you'll find here in this region. Now these behemoths are essentially king of the trees. Some can grow upwards of over 370 feet in height. They are huge. They are the world's tallest tree. And California is very, very lucky to have about 95% of the remaining redwoods in the world. And over the next 2 days, that's right, 2 days, it's one of those locations, we'll be getting the privilege to understand and uncover the treasured story behind these great giants of nature. And we'll also get to appreciate the true magnitude to how much of an effort it has taken for these trees to be preserved. Right here at Redwood National and State Park. Yeah, that's right. How weird. When we go to state parks, we'll say state park. When we go to national parks, we'll say this national park. But Redwood National and State Parks is a great cooperative amalgamation of both the National Park Service and California's state park system. It's a cooperative effort, both with the same mission to preserve, conserve, and protect the redwood tree. Wow, this area seems so lush with vegetation. Is it fair to ask the question whether this area belongs to the classification of a rainforest? I mean, surely we're not in a tropical setting, but there are such things as temperate rainforests. Either way, I think it's a sure thing that we've now reached the definitive Pacific Northwest. When we were in San Francisco or Fort Ross, I mean, some could say that that's still just California, not quite the Pacific Northwest. But as of now, we are much closer to states like Washington and Oregon in biogeography than anywhere else in California. So, welcome to the Pacific Northwest. So you all thought I was playing a video trick, editing the size and scale of the video frame to make these trees look larger? No, you are incorrect. I'm just a normal dude, and we're standing at the trunk of this behemoth right here. It's huge. This is just the trunk, and it goes up for hundreds of feet further past the field of view of that camera. And just walking through any of the state parks or the national park, you will soon realize how small an individual is compared to the vast nature around you, and furthermore, why it's so important to preserve these trees from any sense of endangerment. Now, although there's a big bulk of redwood trees at the Redwood National and State Parks, it's not all redwoods here. In fact, for a long stretch around these few acres nearby, it's prairie. This is a wild elk prairie. In the distance you can see wild elk. Danger, do not approach on foot. Here on the Coverage Project, we're all about safety, so we gotta follow these signs. Do not approach on foot. And this is probably the limit I will reach, but as you can see, wild elk grazing on the wild grasses of the California prairies here in the Redwood National and State Parks. Oh, Mr. Elk, I don't think you're allowed past those gates towards me, just like I'm not allowed approaching where you are past that gate. Well, it's good to meet you. Nice to meet you. Oh my goodness. We should probably walk a little bit further away, but amazing to see such wild creatures. Sure, they're in a preserve area, but how cool. Oh goodness, these elk are really getting greedy. I guess literally the grass is always greener on the other side. Well, we are really getting into the thick of this lush vegetation. It's not quite wilderness, but it's the closest thing to it. You can also, from this point, feel the breezes of wind, the cold air from the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. We are very, very, very close, once again, to the Pacific Ocean. I mean, it is called the North Coast for a reason. Now, if there wasn't this trail, one, I would have no idea where to go. I would most likely get lost in the thick of this bush. But if there wasn't a trail, yes, at that point it would be considered wilderness. There's a lot of just various names. It's a game of semantics when you look at a map of Redwood National and State Park. Not only is it a cluster of state parks and the national park, which kind of serves as a buffer zone all around the original state parks that preceded the national park status designation, but there's also state wilderness, and it's a very jigsaw-esque layout. We're approaching a big highlight of this, in particular, this state park. Today we're in Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park. Tomorrow we're gonna be in a different one. But if all this naming convention stuff is a bit confusing, don't worry. I've been confused all day. But you can still technically consider yourself within the national park because everywhere, no matter whose domain it is, it's a cooperative effort to preserve this area. So in a state park you might see National Park Service rangers, and then while you might be in the national park itself, you might see people in uniforms of California State Parks Department. Oh, isn't this terrific? Tell me we are not in paradise right now. We are in what's known as the Fern Canyon. Now, millions of years ago, this was filled with water, probably draining into the Pacific Ocean that way. But as the waters receded, it left behind a trace of its ancient past. So these canyons were formed. The canyon walls we look at right now are teeming with geologic history. And of course, life eventually finds its way onto these canyon walls. We have mosses dripping with water, leaves, and of course, the item for which this canyon is named, ferns. And they all call this canyon home. Would you be surprised if I told you that Redwood National and State Parks is on the long list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites all around the world? Oh yeah. Not for any human-made contribution, but rather for its natural and biological significance. This is breathtaking, and it's very rare you're gonna find these anywhere else in the world. So we already know from our excursion today that the Redwood Coast is a uniquely pristine place with a very, very special ecosystem. But what happened once humans arrived in this place? This place was already thousands upon thousands, if not millions of years old. But then comes a new chapter, the human chapter. They say that once you hit the Pacific Northwest, the coastline gets a lot more peaceful. I'm not talking about the waves, of course. Those are just as powerful anywhere else on the Pacific coastline. I'm talking about the environment. I mean, do you see any beachside hotels, any pay-to-enter beaches where you gotta pay $20 admission for the little wristband? Do you see any hot dog stands, pizzerias, boardwalks? No. The Pacific coastline up here, large part, remains the same as it did for the last couple hundred years. Sure, maybe the loggers who entered these areas cut down a few trees, but largely it's a very peaceful, serene atmosphere here. At first, it was the Yurok and the Tolowa tribes that lived around this northern edge of the Redwood Coast. You can correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not pronouncing those tribe names correctly, but they were the ones who lived here, and they generally lived off the land. They lived along the rivers and streams right along the California coast, living in houses and villages, all constructed out of this redwood. They sailed along the canoes built with those same redwood trees. And they lived off of subsistence. They didn't take more than they really needed. And then, of course, as we mentioned previously in our journeys through California, the gold rush occurred. For centuries, the native people lived here, and then an overwhelming amount of immigrants came from the east to California. They were looking for gold. And it wasn't just the Sierra Nevadas that they settled all over that operations seemed to have potential. So with this huge influx of people, the original natives were overwhelmed. They were decimated by new American policies. It's a tragic tale that I've covered previously. And in addition to having the natives' way of life permanently altered till today, the settlers that came to California also noticed, hey, there's a lot of wood here in the northern coast. So what do you expect these frontiersmen to do? They cut everything down. They set up commercial logging enterprises all over these state parks, national park, this whole area. This was the new gold rush. The Redwood rush, if you want to call it that. Yeah, with all these businesses popping up, sawmills all over the coast where those redwood trees once stood. There was a lot of money to be had. It was a lucrative industry. But as a consequence, these redwood forests that were numerous, abundant throughout California's northern coast, began to disappear at an alarming rate. So what happens now? We're at a crisis with these redwoods disappearing from the face of the earth. Private businesses are gobbling up these acres of forests and turning them into something not so much of a forest anymore. So what happens? Well, I will reveal that to you tomorrow, which means this ends our day here, our first day here in Redwood National and State Parks. Yeah. It's been a long day, but we covered a lot, and we end here at the beautiful waves of the Pacific coastline. So coming to you from the beautiful Pacific coastline. Yes, even the coastline is protected by these state and national parks. More travels to come. I will see you at the next location.